Hi, I'm Camille,
I'm Colette.
I'm Courtney.
and we're going to be presenting on inequality and the SAT test. So, the problem at hand is that the SAT test discriminates against underprivileged and ethnic and racial minorities. The solution that we are proposing is to discontinue use of the SAT, including the ACT test, and that in placement, schools should consider adding an essay requirement so that we no longer have to use standardized testing. And this will allow students to present themselves accordingly in a way that they wish to without the disadvantages of standardized testing. So, to introduce this, we're going to start with some history, and it begins with Carl Brigham. He was a eugenicist and professor of psychology at Princeton University, and he was actually commissioned by the College Board to be the lead developer of the SAT. So, the person who is developing this test was a eugenicist. His history includes administering IQ tests to over 2 million recruits in the Army. And some of the beliefs that he held was that testing shows the supremacy of the Nordic race group, and also that immigrants should not be intermingling in the American gene pool. So ultimately, the SAT was influenced by IQ test and eugenics. The SAT was first taken by students in 1926, and the goal for the test was to assess an aptitude for learning. Therefore, they claimed that the SAT was uncoachable because it was a test of general knowledge. This is extremely inaccurate today as many students undergo coaching to improve their test scores. Some featured questions on the SAT are specifically culturally favored towards Caucasian Americans. Today, there are 2.2 million test takers every year, and many colleges use it as a standard of admissions. So, some reasons for inequality in the SAT is that wealthy families have a huge advantage over impoverished families. This is because, first of all, they're able to send their children to better schools. This can be because they live in a wealthier location with better private schools with more funding, or because they have the money to send their children to private school for a better education. Wealthy families are also able to put their children in tutoring and test prep because they can afford the expensive fees. Wealthy families also have the means for their children to be evaluated for extra time. Getting evaluated by a specialist can cost up to $10,000, and a lot of families could never even afford this. It's known that in the top 1% of income, 5.8% of students have 504 accommodations, compared to 1.5% of students having 504 accommodations in the bottom 1% of income. Also, white students have accommodations at a higher rate than any race. Having these accommodations means that students can have extra time on the SAT, and this can really make a difference in their scores. Another reason for inequality is that wealthy families are able to have their children take the test multiple times. A single SAT test with an essay costs $68. Sometimes this fee can be waived for um, reasons, but they can't take it multiple times like other students are able to. So the subject of test prep is like the main reason for inequality. And test prep is a $1 billion industry, and the SAT tutoring makes up a quarter of this. So it's like a huge industry. It's been known that wealthy families can pay up to $1,000 an hour for SAT tutoring. Also, some companies will have scholarships available, but there are requirements like a high GPA and enrollment in rigorous courses to even apply for these scholarships. This makes it difficult for underprivileged students to qualify because their schools may not offer AP courses. On average, with test prep, students can expect to see a 50% gain in points available. This means that, for example, if a student scores a 1200 on their SAT test, once they undergo tutoring, the student can potentially score 1400.
So, one aspect of culture that faces inequality in regards to the SAT is someone's ethnic and racial identity. Oh, can you go back 2 slides? No, more back, more back. No, other way.
Wait, it's literally not working. Oh my gosh. It's okay. Wait,
I
I
think you can pause the recording. Okay. Should I just go?
yeah.
Okay. So, one aspect of cultures that faces inequality in regards to the SAT is someone's ethnic and racial identity. So, the average SAT score in 2019 had white students getting a 1,114, Asian students getting a 1,223, Black students getting a 933, and Latino students getting a 978. I feel like this difference can be shown in this graph on the right, where the colors make it really easy to see that the Black and Latino students are on the lower spectrum in terms of their score, while as white and Asian students are on the higher one. This is shown as well in the math section. There's inequality in both sections of the SAT, but it's very clear in the math one, where you have white students gain on average in 2020 a 547, Asian students gain a 632, Black students gain a 454, and Latino students gain a 478. So again, it's that same kind of discrepancy in scores that we saw in the whole score on average. And then College Board puts out a college readiness score. This year it was 530, which is supposed to be the baseline score in order to succeed your first year of college. So that's kind of, they're saying if you're above this score, then you're going to succeed in college, which is kind of a big claim. Um, and over half of white students are above this score. 4 out of 5 Asian students are, but then less than a fourth of Black students are, and less than a third of Latino ones are. So again, it's that same pattern as before, but I think this is just really kind of escalated to even say that the majority of white and Asian students are going to succeed and ready for their first year of college, while the majority of Black and Latino ones aren't. Okay, next slide. So problems with the SAT in regards to ethnicity and race, kind of like what's the reason for this difference that we see. One of them is question bias. So the questions can be culturally biased, which is when certain groups are performing consistently lower than others. So this might be that they're interpreting critical terms in the test differently. And you can see in this graph on the right here, which I think shows it really clearly, how over the years, certain groups are consistently performing better than others, and it's the white and Asian groups. It can also be statistically biased. So that's when two individuals with different races get the same score, but perform differently on other things. So maybe they get the same score, but they're different subsections of the test. They got different scores on them. Or maybe they got the same score on the SAT, but one of them got straight A's in school and the other's failing all their classes. Both of these types of bias can be seen in the ACT. So I looked at a study and it compared hard item questions to easy item questions. And a hard item question is one that is kind of dependent on rare vocabulary, while an easy item question is dependent on more typical terms. And the study actually found that Black students are better at hard item questions, while white students are better at easy item questions. So you would think with this knowledge, the SAT would try to balance these two kinds of questions to make it more equal for everybody. But instead, what happened is that the easy questions increased, and so did reading ones, which Black students also statistically do worse on than white students. So at first I was really confused, like why they would increase the easy questions after seeing this and make it even more unequal. And it kind of reminded me of the Color of Fear film that we watched in class, when the white men were told to like think about if they were going to make it more equal for kids applying for college. And they were so scared at the thought of their privilege going away. And what if it's harder for my white children to get into these schools? And I think while everyone likes to pretend that we're in an equal world, I think people kind of realize that we're not and are very scared of it going in the other direction. And I think that's what happened here with this study. but it's important to obviously take these results, and we do need to make it equal because, I mean, picture yourself on the other side, you would want it to be. So next slide. So our intervention and solution, why getting rid of the SAT would increase ethnic and racial diversity of just applicants, not even the student body. I looked at a study and they took data from 28 colleges, which is 955,744 applicants, and they compared test optional schools. So that's a school where you can submit an SAT or not, it's up to you, and schools where you have to submit an SAT. And they found that when there were test optional schools, you had an increase in Latino and Black applicants, and that these underrepresented minorities, when they had the option, chose not to submit the SAT, which shows that they are feeling this inequality with it and obviously don't like stand behind their scores, whereas the white students felt way more comfortable just submitting their scores. And the SAT has this whole claim that it's good at predicting success your first year of college. So they actually followed these students when they went to school, and they found that they graduated at an equal or higher rate to their classmates, which just shows that looking at extracurriculars and grades and kind of the person as a whole is just as good, if not better, of a predictor of their future success than just an SAT score. So next slide. And then this is kind of the other part of why getting rid of the SAT would increase ethnic and racial representation. So now no longer just the application, but actually on campus. I looked at another study that took data from traditionally underrepresented racial and ethnic groups and found that when they had this test optional policy, there was an increased representation of them on campus. I read kind of an interesting story about this kid, Ian Hamowitz. He's a sophomore at George Washington University, and he describes himself as the first Nicaraguan American Jewish Latino person that most people meet. He grew up in New Mexico, and his freshman year of high school, he didn't have a math teacher. It just wasn't offered to him, was not an option. So he was always kind of worried about how he was going to go to college with this kind of lack in his math skills. But anyway, he was able to apply to schools that didn't require the SAT or had it optional and get into them, and is now succeeding at college and increasing the diversity of the student body. And this SAT score isn't holding him back just because of this past experience that he had. Okay, next slide. Okay, so this is another area of the SAT that we see inequality, and it's in regard to socioeconomic status. So for family yearly income, and this was kind of talked about before, but I'll just go over it quickly again. Family yearly income is a big predictor of test scores. So if a family is making over $20,000 a year, they're getting an average test score of around 1,230. Whereas if a family is making less than 20,000 a year, they're getting around a 970. That's a 260 point difference purely because of family income, which again is shown on this graph on the right, where you can see with these purple bars that as your family income goes up, so does your test score. And then also in terms of school type, so religious affiliated schools and independent ones, probably private, you get an average of a 1,150, whereas a public school, you're getting about 1,060. So this is completely irrelevant of the person, of their intelligence, of how well they're going to do in college. This is just purely based off of money that we see these test scores increase. Okay, next slide. So the problems with the SAT in regards to socioeconomic status, again, we kind of went over this, but so the price of the SAT without an essay is around $50, and then with an essay around 60, but I think it can be a little more. But most people do a lot more than that. You can buy College Board's SAT prep books, and I found one on Amazon. It was $30, but I know there's a lot that can be a lot more expensive because they'll include like practice tests in them. And then also I know when I was looking for one for the ACT, they have like different ones are better at different things. So you might have different brands that are selling them, and one's good in the math section and one's good in the English. So it actually kind of pays to own multiple of these books. And then tutoring can be extremely helpful. My family, I had a tutor for the ACT and we were as cost efficient as possible. And I only went a few times. And when I asked my mom, it still cost us around $1,000. And that was doing the bare minimum with tutoring. So it gets very expensive very fast. Aid can be offered if you are enrolled or eligible to participate in the National School Lunch Program or enrolled in a federal, state, or local program that aids students from low-income families. Then you're eligible for a fee waive. This covers the cost of an SAT with or without the essay. But the big limitation on this is that you can only take it twice. So everyone else can take it unlimited amount of times. You can take the SAT as many times as you want, and they'll keep up to your most recent 6 scores. So they have the opportunity to do this massive super score, which you can do for some colleges, where you get to take your best scores from each section that you've taken and kind of put them together to make your best overall test. So you don't have to do it just from one city in one time. If you can only take the test twice, your range you can pull from for your super score is significantly smaller. As well, I know when I first went in, my first time taking the ACT, I was just kind of trying to figure out what it was like. I was super nervous. I had no idea what to expect. And I got a terrible score. And I was able to take it a few more times and really get comfortable with it and improve as I went. So only being able to take it twice is a huge limitation on these students. Okay, next. So finally, our solution, again, why getting rid of the SAT would increase diversity with respect to socioeconomic status. Overall, throughout the studies that I read, there's just an increase in socioeconomic diversity when you have the test as optional or just not a factor at all. These students aren't being held back by it, and they end up coming to these colleges. I looked at one study that used applicant admissions data and patterns from SAT optional schools and kind of created their own scenario where they did a 30% increase of low scoring applicants. So these are applicants from a low socioeconomic status, and kind of push them past that original, oh, did you meet this score on the ACT or SAT or higher? They pushed them past that, so their score was no longer a factor, and it was just their grades and extracurriculars and their essays, and put them in this applicant pool. And once test scores were no longer a factor and everyone was on an equal playing field, they found that there was an increase in those accepted from lower and middle class families. So it wasn't just a majority upper class population anymore. They had more of that diversity worked in once you just move past this testing factor, which I think is a big reason to get rid of the test and just put everybody on an equal playing field.
So the SAT also has a lot of problems with inequality in terms of developmental and acquired disabilities. There are currently 9 accommodations available, including a large print test book, a Braille textbook, Braille with raised line drawings, pre-recorded audio, a reader script, assistive technology compatible, large block answer sheets, 2-week testing window, or 2 days testing. Students must be approved for services from students with disabilities in order to use these accommodations. And in order to be approved, you need a documented disability. So students are eligible for 504 plans if they have a physical or mental condition that has substantially limit a major life activity. And this needs to be pre-approved in order to access these disabilities or these accommodations. And this graph shows that accommodations have increased over the past few years. Next slide. There are problems with the current accommodations for the SAT, which includes that individuals of minority races are diagnosed with disabilities less often. So these students have less access to 504 plans and therefore cannot use the accommodations that are put in place. And the stigma around having to use accommodations leaves many students to avoid using them. Even if they are eligible for accommodations, they may not access them or take the SAT up on this offer because of social stigma surrounding the idea of having a disability. An analysis of numbers from the 2000 California audit of the SAT report yielded the following figures. White students were overrepresented. Students coming from families whose incomes were over $100,000 were overrepresented by 139%. and students from private schools were overrepresented by 100%. And 18% of the requests granted were questionable merit and gave students an unwarranted and unfair advantage. This means that some students that may not actually qualify technically for these accommodations are working their way into the system in order to be diagnosed with a disability they may not have in order to access accommodations and get more time on the SAT. Next slide. Okay, so this graph, the green line is the distribution of scores for the SAT taken by students without any accommodations. This is a normal bell curve, which is how the SAT is designed to show students. The blue line distribution of SAT scores is for students who use accommodations. This is not a normal bell curve. This is bimodal, which means that there are two peaks in the graph. This shows that there's a problem with the way that accommodations are granted for students, because accommodations should allow students with disabilities to fall closer to the green line. However, this blue line is showing that the accommodations are granted to students who do not need them, and then it helps more than the amount that helps students who really do need them, which is pushing the blue line further to the right than the green line. Next slide. Okay, recommendations presented based on the California audit. These are to ensure that students with learning disabilities are identified and receive the services they need, rather than ineligible students being granted these advantages. So we need better procedures to identify and evaluate students with disabilities to ensure that all eligible students are receiving the accommodations they need. Districts should ensure that staff, parents, and students are all aware of the services available under 504. This way, everyone knows the accommodations that are out there and whether or not they qualify for eligibility. To ensure that ineligible students do not gain an unfair advantage, schools should provide 504 plans only to students whose impairment substantially limits a major life activity. These decisions should be made only by a team who is qualified, rather than a parent or someone who is close to the student who may have a conflict of interest. And schools should provide or request extra time on standardized tests only when such an accommodation is warranted and documented in the student's IEP or 504 plan. Next slide. So getting rid of the SAT would increase diversity with regard to disability, because minority races are not often granted the accommodations they need, and as a result, they score lower because they may have diagnosed or undiagnosed learning disabilities that are not accounted for in their scores. These lower scores lead to a lower rate of being accepted into colleges, which results in less diversity on campuses. Similarly, aside from being accepted, many of these students do not even apply to schools that require the SAT because they feel that their score does not reflect their abilities as a student. And therefore, they're less likely to apply in the first place. Although the previously presented solutions could possibly help the issue, there's no way to really make sure that these guidelines are being followed. So moving away from the SAT would ensure that unfair practices are not taking place. Next slide. The goal of our intervention is to make the college application process more fair to all types of students through the abolition of the SAT standardized test and a movement towards essay questions instead. In order to evaluate the efficacy of this intervention, we have to determine if diversity has actually increased. And we will do this using a time series analysis with two categories. First, we will survey the demographics of students that applied to college before the implementation of our intervention. We will measure the racial, socioeconomic, and disability interventions or demographics. We will measure these variables again after the implementation of our intervention in order to track a change in diversity of applicants as a result of our plan. We will repeat this process for students on college campuses to determine whether our plan increased the diversity of acceptances rather than just applications. If we see an increase in diversity in these three categories for applications and acceptances, then we will know that our intervention was successful at accomplishing the goal of making the college application process more fair to various types of students. Next slide. In conclusion, the SAT is unfair because it discriminates against ethnic and racial minorities, people of low socioeconomic status, and people with disabilities. Colleges and universities could increase their diversity by reframing their application process to eliminate the use of standardized tests and move toward essay questions to allow students to present themselves the way that they want to be seen by these colleges. This is relevant to us because we are college students and we could benefit from having a more diverse student body with students of various backgrounds, cultural traditions, communication styles, identities, and worldviews. Thank you for listening to our presentation.
Okay, so now we have some discussion questions for you guys. And the first one is, do you feel as if your race or ethnicity affected your performance on either the SAT or the ACT, and why or why not? And the second question is, the Cal Poly application assesses standardized test scores and high school grades, but does not use essays for admission. How do you think this impacts our campus diversity? Let us know. Thank you.